if you live in a new build or know someone who does, you might already be all too familiar with the fact that Britain has a housing problem, not just the severe shortage of housing that we have and the inflated prices of housing, but the quality of new homes. So the government has promised to build 1.5 million new homes by the end of this parliament, but something that's affecting a lot of people but remains underreported is the terrible quality of some of the houses being built. Now, Anoosh, you've been reporting on this. Let's talk about some of the places you went to, Keir Starmer's constituency, where you would think that house building and quality would get maybe some extra attention, given it's the Prime Minister's constituency. But, I mean, frankly, some of the places you visited there sound absolutely appalling. Tell us about some of the stuff you saw.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is Holborn and St Pancras, Starmer's constituency. Camden, which is a North London borough that lots of people might have heard of because it's, historically part of the British music scene. But it's had a lot of new build construction in the past decade or so. And one of these blocks, it's a low-rise block of 7 pretty beautiful high-ceiling split-level flats. Expensive because it's in London in a desirable borough, sort of £1 million-ish each. And I went to go and look at these flats because someone who lived in one of them had got in touch with me, telling me that the nightmare that they'd been through since buying these flats, he and his neighbour had put down 900 grand and 850 grand. Respectively, on these flats that they thought were sort of luxury. They thought they'd be their homes for life. He'd spent his life savings on his. He'd sold his startup. He's a tech entrepreneur. And honestly, the quality of these flats was really shocking. Like I saw them from the street, and they looked quite beautiful. But just even walking through the door to get into sort of the shared bit before you get into the building, I noticed that their pigeonholes where their post would be, all the doors were dangling off them, and they said that they never ever got post because it would always be stolen, and so they didn't ask for things to be delivered there. I offered to send them copies of this magazine. They said there's no point. The intercom hadn't worked for ages. The lift hadn't worked since 2020. The staircase to get up to the flats was wonky, like I could literally feel it beneath my feet. When I sat down on his sofa to do the interview, a lorry went past on the street and the building literally swayed. Wow. I could put my hand through the cracks in the walls outside. None of the windows would open because the building was so warped that they couldn't open the windows anymore. They'd had black water from the roof gushing in, mold. She, the woman who is his neighbour, she has a child, and there was mold in the child's bedroom. He couldn't use a whole floor of his flat, which was the master bedroom and the ensuite, because there was such an awful damp smell that it was making him feel ill. Yeah. So it was shocking. It's an extreme example. Not every new build is like this, but it was for me a sort of cautionary tale for buyers of new builds at how, if your developer and your warranty provider and your local MP can't help you or won't help you, then you are literally stuck to the point nearly of bankruptcy, because they're paying all this on legal fees to try and get out of this situation.
And these are, these are people who, have a good bit of money.
And they did admit that they felt they were lucky that they did have the money to try and fight their case. Yeah.
But they've been, when you buy a toaster on a credit card, you have consumer rights. And you're extremely well protected. If it doesn't go well, then you're guaranteed your money back. But I mean, something people often say about buying homes is that you might go and see it a couple of times, and then you make the biggest spending decision of your life based on just having had a quick look. But there's supposed to be an industry around you that protects you from that. The brief nature of that decision, as in professional surveys, people who can hold the managers of the property and the developers to account. But that's just is the industry just not set up for that in this case? Well,
you're supposed to have the first 2 years of minor defects in your new build home covered by the developer, and the sort of warranty standard is 10 years for problems with your home. But the problem that homeowners are encountering, and I've spoken to people who are going through this, but also to MPs who are hearing from their constituents going through this all across the country, not just sort of wealthy house buyers in London, is when they move in and they realise that these problems are there, within the 2-year period or the 10-year warranty, they are hit with a wall of silence from the developer. The warranty provider tries to get out of it, and it's a constant battle to try and get the problems fixed. And so people are either having to spend their own money to get these things fixed, or they're in this sort of limbo in a house that isn't built to the standard that they were hoping for, sort of fighting every day to get this thing done. And you know, I've even heard from people who have had to miss work because suddenly the contractors will turn up when they haven't told them that they'll turn up to have a look at the problem or try and fix it. So it's really affecting people's quality of life when they feel that they've made a decision that's supposed to make their life more secure.
Yeah, I guess it's a similar situation to people who have a rubbish landlord who will just sort of randomly decide to make changes to their property and that kind of thing, and that's what somebody who has, saved up loads of money for a long time
out of that situation,
supposed to have escaped.
Yeah.
But there's a tension here as well between, I guess, Keir Starmer as a local MP and also Keir Starmer as PM, right? Because on the one hand, as a local MP, you would be wanting to hold these developers to account, but as Prime Minister or as a government, that you want those same developers to build loads and loads of houses, and you want them to be as unconstrained and as unregulated as possible, right? Yeah,
well, that's something that the residents of this particular estate were really concerned about, because when he was in opposition, he was saying to the department that was then DLUC, the housing department, you should put my constituents back to the position that they were before they bought these houses. The warranty should, guarantee that they that they're not in this situation, was quite strident about it. But since he's become Prime Minister, it's been very much I've passed this on to the Ministry of Housing and they'll see what they can say. And the position has softened a lot. They've also started backing, more rights for small house builders, so for smaller blocks. And of course, they want to stay on the right side of developers because they want 1.5 million homes built before the end of the Parliament, and also new towns, up to 12 new towns being built across Britain as well. So there is obviously a political limit on how damning Keir Starmer and his government can be about developers who are sort of ducking the standards that people expect.
Yeah, and I guess the central point of the government as they see it is to produce economic growth, right? And the housing industry, the housing market is such a part of that.
Yeah.
Employs so many people, the transaction's so big, it generates so much tax that if there are a few casualties along the way, then I guess it's fairly easy to see which side the government is going to land on.
Yeah, but the problem with the idea that there are a few casualties on the way, and I've spoken to people in the house building industry who have been on these sites, who have worked on these houses, as well as MPs representing constituents who are stuck in these houses. They've all made the point that they feel that if house building is rolled out on this sort of greater and faster scale, then it will become a sort of very widespread problem. And I think most people now know someone who might either be stuck in a sort of difficult leasehold position, or with a flat that's not to their standard, or a house that's not to the standard that they were expecting. If that's rolled across the country, then it could be one of these sort of time bombs, a bit like the concrete in the schools, in 2023, when all these schools had to close after the summer holidays because they had unsafe concrete in them. We could be building up a real problem in the built environment for the future.
Yeah, and that's what people like the National Audit Office always say, is that if you just leave the problem and you say, it'll be all right, it'll happen in another parliament, somebody else will fix it, it gets incredibly expensive to do that over the long term. One of the sort of interesting expeditions that I've been on to have a look around the housing market was with the geographer Danny Dorling. I remember walking through Oxford with him, and we had a look at a big posh house that was built in the, I think, 18th or 19th century. And he pointed out that you could look at the front of this house and you could physically see, almost like a geologist looking at layers in rock, you could see the class system in this house. In that, when you looked at the ground floor and the first floor, had very high ceilings. You could kind of see where the ceilings were. They had big bay windows, and you could see that there were large rooms with high ceilings and lots of light. And then on the top floor, possibly the top two floors, were much thinner and had lots of little windows, because they were the servants' quarters. They were less heated, they had less light, and they had lower ceilings, physically less space. So you could physically see the class system being imposed on people in the 19th century by the housing market. But in town centres, you have these very expensive, Georgian, Edwardian, Victorian houses that are close to lots of public transport links because they're all built around train stations, and then you have these large new build estates being built out of town, and there are government incentives that push newer buyers towards those, and particularly people with like less capital to start with, using things like Help to Buy or lifetime ISAs. So in a way, do you think it's fair to say the housing market is physically manifesting and sort of cementing the class system still in this country?
It is. It absolutely is. And that was one of the things I was quite apprehensive about when I was writing this piece. I didn't want to come across as snobby towards these new build estates, because that's often sort of what's happened. There's a few accounts that people might have seen on social media, new build hate, and they put up these, they're very sneery about pictures of the sort of worst offenders of these new build estates, which can be quite identikit and soulless, and built with sort of these Escher drawing fencing and bins and tarmac where benches and trees should be, and they should be planned better. They are designed poorly, or perhaps unimaginatively. But there is a little bit of snobbery there. There's a good book called from 2023 by this sociologist called Dan Evans, who I've interviewed, called A Nation of Shopkeepers, where he writes that the class system is nowhere more apparent than in attitudes towards housing. So, you might have what he calls the professional managerial classes, or perhaps the people who live in those Victorian, Georgian, Edwardian houses in town centres that you just mentioned, who might look down upon the so-called sort of noddy box, sort of boxy, box fresh, red brick kind of, grey roof slate houses that are, built in these expanses between towns and the countryside across the country. And they sort of favour their own kind of ramshackle houses, which are, drafty, leaky, damp. But because they're sort of period properties, they're seen as a better bet. And actually, speaking to some of the people who have built new builds, they wish that they'd bought an old house instead, because at least with an old house, you might expect it to have problems. Whereas a newly built one, it's, slightly more enraging if it doesn't work.
Which is absolutely crazy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because, Victorian houses are rubbish. They don't have proper foundations. They have single layer walls, single thing of brickwork. Professional terms there. Their plaster is literally made using horsehair. They are crap houses. But they should all be knocked down and replaced with nice, properly insulated concrete boxes. Do write in if you disagree. Michael Gove, especially. But yeah, you're right. And government housing policy. I mentioned Gove there. He was one of the architects, if you'll pardon the pun, of like this idea that new build houses should kind of fit in with like the houses that we used to build, that they should be sort of pointy and red brick and that kind of thing. Yeah. And do you think it's, developers are sort of let off a lot of the quality issues as long as they fit in with that general idea that like this toy town version of the past will fit in with what the government will allow them to build? Well,
yeah, this is one of the problems. So, on the Conservatives' side, they're obsessed with this idea of building beautiful, but obviously beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And there is a bit of an attachment to sort of kitschy revival styles that, might not necessarily mean better quality housing or better designed estates, just houses that look like sort of ersatz versions of Georgian townhouses, which you see in Poundbury in Dorset, which is the sort of the town that King Charles built, as it's called. So, you have that side of things. But then on the other side, you have the YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard, who don't sort of, they sort of really dismiss any idea of that aesthetics matter at all. And they just want housing built, at whatever cost. And I think the problem with that is that you do get these places where the developers skimp on the infrastructure and the local amenities that you need to live in a proper place. So one of the places that I visited in this piece, it was called Miller's Field, just outside of Norwich, just swathes and swathes of these kind of copy and paste houses. They don't, look particularly bad to me. I live in an sort of 60s local authority block that is very drafty. I think it has those single walls that you so accurately pinpointed, Will. So they didn't look so bad to me, but it was just that there was nothing there. And actually, some residents who I interviewed, one of them said, I just wish that there was a shop to pop to. They have to drive everywhere to get to anything, and there doesn't feel like there's a sense of community there. And so, YIMBYs, I think, can go too far in the sense that we do need to build places that foster belonging. You've seen the failures of some new towns that were built after the war. You can cause problems if you don't build proper neighbourhoods.
Yeah. And do you think, in a way, that divide between the NIMBYs and YIMBYs, I can understand why there is such strong feeling on both sides, because obviously your own home and where you live and the character where you live is so personal. It matters so much because you're constantly surrounded by it. But I guess they're, in a way, they're both right in that we need lots more housing, but we also need it to not, be of a decent standard. Yeah. And I guess to a certain extent, both wrong.
Yeah.
And do you think that in a way is sort of where the developers are allowed to sort of get away with building poorer quality housing because no one can agree, because there's always a planning issue to get past that the NIMBYs will have brought up, or because there's always, a bunch of people who say, look, we just badly need loads more housing, or, sort of we're going to have to spend an absolute fortune as a country on the results of the fact that there isn't enough housing. That's the kind of gap into which unscrupulous developers can fit and build stuff that isn't fit for purpose.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's that gap, that vacuum. I think I described it as a policy vacuum, can mean that what is already quite an exploitative industry seeking sort of 20% profit margins on these estates that they build can sort of get away with these lower standards bargain basement kind of style building, because there's such a desperate need for housing and people are happy to pay for these houses, but also because the government keeps imposing these house building targets. So someone I spoke to who has started a professional snagging company to go and fix issues that they find with new builds said 1.5 million houses, great for the house builders, great for us, but absolutely terrible for the people buying them, because he's and his inspectors are seeing so many issues, basic issues in the houses that have been built. So I think they do exploit that gap.
Yeah. And they, like you say, the people who have been pushed into the new build part of the market, they've the government has moved a huge amount of money to help make that happen, hasn't it? I mean, I think Help to Buy is sort of £29 billion worth of interest-free loans. And then you've got lifetime ISAs. I mean, obviously you have also the effect of Right to Buy in the 80s. It's kind of, do you think it's right that the government has been pumping the housing market in that way?
No, I mean, they've been, like you say, they've been sort of juicing demand for new builds using these schemes. But then when people sort of actually buy the new build and are either stuck because of the building safety issues that were exposed post-Grenfell, where they're having to pay their own money to for the remedial works to these buildings to make them fire safe, for example. So that's sort of a trap for leaseholders who have bought some of these new flats in particular, or they're in one of these new builds where it's just not built to standard and they're battling with the developer to get it up to standard. That's a sense of betrayal. I think there's a sort of social contract issue here where, in fact, one of the house homeowners who I interviewed said, the government encouraged me to buy a new build. I did everything right. I worked hard. I started my own business. I've paid tax. I bought a house because that's what you're supposed to do in Britain, when you're successful. And that now I'm beating down the door of the Prime Minister to get some justice for the situation that I've ended up in. And I've spoken to people from other pieces about the cladding crisis who have said, I would have been a lot better off if I'd just rented all my life.
Yeah. And that's something that extends beyond housing as well, isn't it? It's something you hear a fair bit as a sort of general political complaint is, I did everything right.
Yeah, everyone says that.
And it still didn't work out.
Yeah. So I think there's a sort of, we don't really have an American dream in this country. The closest thing we have to it, of the British dream, is home ownership. Yeah. And there's a betrayal of pursuing that dream. And I think that can cause political volatility, that sense that you've been let down. We already feel let down by everyone else, don't we? You know, from water companies to dentists to, you know, your local council. Like there's just a feeling of being ripped off in this country. And this is a layer on top of that.
Yeah. Now, when a government puts a number on these things, I think it's always right to take government sort of targets with a bit of a pinch of salt, but particularly with house building, because it's, in a way, they're saying to developers, right, here's something we really, really want done. So we'll look the other way on certain things if you will help us to meet this incredibly ambitious target. Do you think it's a good idea for governments to set that kind of target? And do you think there's any chance they will get to 1.5 million homes by 2029, 30?
Well, I was speaking to someone who until recently worked in Number 10 who said, you know, Angela Rayner knows there's no way they're going to build 1.5 million homes in that period. So, you know, from that conversation and, you know, just from talking to people about the labour shortage, you know, construction workers are hard to come by. Lots of reliance on migrant workers to do some of the basic jobs that you need on site. I think it's quite an ambitious target. I would have said that it was a good idea to try and build more houses because of the housing deficit in this country. But from seeing the quality of some of these places and from speaking to people who are working on the houses who all said the government needs to pause, we need to change how we do this before we keep building these things. I think that I'm a little bit more sceptical about, you know, just slapping great big targets onto these things and allowing an industry to sort of get on with it, which isn't properly regulated or scrutinised. So the piece has definitely changed my mind slightly on house building targets. I don't know what you think personally, Will.
Yeah, I think it's just, you know, when you're a government negotiating with an industry, if you make it really clear that, like, you're staking a great deal of political capital on a number, that it is then up to the industry. You know, the government's not building 1.5 million homes.
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe they could. Maybe, if the state was building homes, then you might be able to promise that. But, yeah, making a promise on behalf of an industry seems like not a great way to then have a deal with that industry, because you've already told them everything that you want and made it clear that it's incredibly important to you politically, and then the power is in their hands.
Yeah.
But, okay, if you could magically produce 1.5 million homes, dot them around the country, what kind of housing would you build and where would you put it?
Well, you need, from the conversations that I've had for this piece, you need high density, you know, housing, because we need to maximise the number of houses that we have. You also need a mix. So what I find really interesting on the estate that I live on, it's a 60s post-war former council block, and it was built in a way for people to live there for life. So there's flats that are bigger for families with gardens. There's flats that are smaller for either a single person or an older person whose family have perhaps left and it's just them and their partner, or them on their own. And the idea was that you would swap as you went through, you know, the different stages of your life. Communal gardens, you know, a row of shops. It was built in a way to serve people's lives rather than just the need for shelter. And so I would probably try to go back to those principles if I was going to design these new build blocks. And actually, I saw this in action in another place just a few miles from Miller's Field that I was describing to you, called Goldsmith Street, which is an estate built in 2019 that won the Sterling Prize because it was seen as such an imaginative way as social housing to house people. And it was just a completely different world. Trees everywhere, interesting design, like looked really cool, you know, curved brickwork, and everyone had a front door and the bins were hidden, and, you know, the pavements were broad. And they had these back alleys behind the houses that they've made curved like that so that they weren't so much of a sort of traditional back alley, with picnic tables and children roller skating through them. People were picnicking under the trees, and there were people having barbecues in their back gardens. And it really felt like someone had designed this estate with living in mind. And also, you know, it was done in a sort of urban area by a council that doesn't have a huge amount of money, and in sort of for residents who are in socio-economically challenging circumstances. So it can be done even when there's not that much money sloshing around, with a bit of imagination and a partnership between public and private bodies. So I think, that there is some optimism. And so that's probably what I'd aim for.